Laura Burns, Head of Terrorism Research for George Washington University's Program on Extremism, and I'm here with Jennifer Baker, Senior Research Fellow at the program. We are here to continue explaining the history of Hamas in the United States and abroad. And we wanted to take a minute to remind everyone that this series is chronological, and it is essential to start at the beginning of the series with episode 1 in order to get a full understanding of this decades-long, very complex conspiracy.
That's right, Laura. So when we last spoke, the Hamas political bureau leaders had been exiled from Jordan in 1999.
That's right. We covered a lot, actually, in the last episode when you think about it, including many of the things that happened between 1997 and 1999. But, before we move forward, I want to go back to 1997, just for a minute. The HLF had put together a fundraising call back in late 1997, and we didn't have time to talk about that in the last episode. But I do think it's important to take a minute to discuss it.
Okay, what was the call?
It was a conference call hosted by the HLF where, attendees could dial in. Like, we didn't have Zoom back then, right? And so people would dial a 1-800 number and dial in. And it was hosted by the HLF, and several prominent Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood leaders spoke on the call. It was dated, I had said late 1997, but it was dated January 31st of 1997.
Okay, who were the Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood leaders at that time?
On the call, the first guy was a guy named Mohamed El-Mezain, and then we had also Muslim Brotherhood leader Kamal al-Halbawi and Hamas leader Mohamed El-Mezain.
And who were they?
So Mohamed El-Mezain was a Hamas leader in the West Bank, actually in Nablus, and he was also, at the time of the call, a senior leader in the Nablus Zakat Committee. And we know, we've talked about that before, that the Holy Land Foundation provided a lot of funds to the Nablus Zakat Committee. Interestingly, Mohamed El-Mezain went on to become an official Hamas parliamentarian. So he's very important to Hamas, but he is now deceased. At the time of this call, he was, again, a Hamas leader in Nablus and also a leader in the Nablus Zakat Committee. Oh, and he was a fundraiser for the HLF. We found in search warrants that we'll talk about later, we found a list of overseas speakers who raised money for the HLF, and Mohamed El-Mezain was one of them. And interestingly, I just keep thinking of things. He was also one of the 1992 deportees to Marj el-Zahor, Lebanon. Remember when Israel deported the Hamas and PIJ leaders that we talked about? And the HLF was one of the first to support those deportees. Well, Mohamed El-Mezain was one of them. So the HLF had a long-standing history with Mohamed El-Mezain.
And Mohamed El-Mezain, who was he?
So I think he goes by Mohamed El-Mezain, and he was one of the HLF's overseas speakers, fundraisers, but he was a senior Hamas leader from the very beginning and also a senior leader in the Islamic University of Gaza. Remember, we talked about that university. That was one of the first entities that the HLF funded in Gaza, and they talked about it in the Philadelphia meeting. It was part of Hamas's infrastructure there in Gaza, very important to it. So he was one of the senior leaders there as well.
So yes, we've spoken quite a bit about the Islamic University in Gaza. What was this call about?
So this call, I think it was during Ramadan. So they were having kind of like a call where people could come together and listen to these speakers. And they spoke about the Holy Land Foundation and the good works that it did. And then they moved on to talk about things that were very interesting. They went on to talk about the advancement of Islamic movements that had liberated themselves from nationalism and secularism. And what they're really talking about here is Islamism as opposed to Islam. We've talked about the difference between those two. They then discussed violent uprisings and said, quote, "It is true that there were revolutions and rebellions, but there are now martyrdom." And in this context, martyrdom is dying for the sake of the cause. And so then Hilbawi went on to state, "We can also say the Islamic world is undergoing a stage of changing from weakness to strength and to the love of martyrdom. And then they go on to say, Yahya Ayash, Ahmed Yassin, Musa Abu Marzouk, and what decisions he took, what understanding, knowledge, bravery, strength, and determination he displayed.
And he is talking about Hamas founder Ahmed Yassin, Hamas political bureau leader who founded the US-based Hamas infrastructure, Musa Abu Marzouk, and Hamas bomb maker Yahya Ayash as heroes.
Yes, he is. They were heroes to this group of individuals and to these entities like the HLF.
Okay, Laura, so last time we spoke about Marzouk being deported to Jordan to join Hamas leader Khalid Mashal, and then the assassination attempt of Mashal that led to the Israeli release of Hamas founder Sheikh Ahmad Yassin. But then the 1999 exile of Hamas leaders from Jordan. Was there any reaction to that exile by these guys in the U.S.?
Yes, there was. On December 9th of 1999, Shukri Abu Baker, again, leader of the HLF, spoke with his brother Jamal Abu Baker about this.
Is this the same brother in Sudan that you spoke with when the assassination attempt was made on Khalid Mashal?
Yes, that is the same brother. And I believe during this particular call, he was still in Sudan. And according to these calls, Jamal Abu Baker, Shukri's brother, maintained close contact with those senior leaders of Hamas that were in Jordan and then exiled and later ended up in Syria. Shukri Abu Baker indicated Jamal knew or believed ahead of time that they would end up being exiled from Jordan. And he then asked him to say hello to the, quote, beloved ones, a reference to Musa Abu Marzouk and Khalid Mashal and the other leaders that were exiled. And Jamal Abu Baker, his brother, responded, I speak with them every other day. Their morale is high. So this should give you kind of some context of how important Shukri and Jamal were to this overall Hamas terrorist organization. Their morale is high, he said. And Shukri responded, well, this is the most important thing, that their morale is high.
So they did not believe the exile would impact their ability to lead Hamas, or did they?
No, they didn't. And, those Hamas leaders pretty quickly set up in Syria and operated there for a number of years. And we'll get to that later on when they ended up departing Syria. But yeah, they didn't really skip a beat.
So Laura, let's stay in 1999 timeframe for just a minute.
Okay.
I think it was December 1999. There was an interesting event regarding a Dallas-based journalist.
Yes, there was. Very interesting, actually. So Steve McGonigal was a journalist, an investigative journalist for the Dallas Morning News. And we talked about him previously. He co-wrote that article with Gail Reeves that was entitled A Paper Trail Leads to Hamas, and where they had interviewed some of the HLF leaders, and they talked about what the HLF and IAP leaders had said, denying they had any affiliation with Hamas. I don't know if you remember that article.
Yes, I do remember that article. It led to a congressional hearing.
Yes, that's right. We talked about that as well. Well, so Steve McGonigal in late 1999 decided that he would take a trip to Gaza, and unbeknownst to the leaders of the HLF here, he showed up on the doorstep of the HLF's Gaza office at the time, much to their surprise.
The HLF had an office there by then?
Yeah, they did. So we kind of skipped over that part, but after they had opened the office in Jerusalem, they also opened offices in Gaza and in the West Bank to kind of add that layer of protection between the money that originated here and the ultimate recipients. So they did. They had offices in both places. And in this instance, there was a call where Baker was informed that Steve McGonigal was at the HLF's Gaza office, and he was very worried that McGonigal might learn or about what he might learn, and did not want anyone to take McGonigal to the home of any martyrs or prisoners' families.
Were they able to limit what he saw there?
From what I can tell from the evidence that was put forth in the HLF trial that we'll talk about later, yes, they were able to kind of surround him with a little bubble and keep him from seeing things that they did not want him to see.
So they were able to continue operating.
Yes, they were. And by the year 2000, Hamas had spent, over, decades radicalizing people within the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. However, the United States and President Clinton at the time continued to pursue a solution for a Palestinian state, despite all of the attacks that Hamas and PIJ had carried out, and despite Hamas radicalizing a large portion of the population. So they continued to pursue this solution for the Palestinian state, and President Clinton arranged a summit called the Camp David Summit. Some of us may remember that, but attempts to make progress there at the Camp David Summit failed.
After 14 days of intensive negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time. As I explained on the eve of the summit, success was far from guaranteed, given the historical, religious, political, and emotional dimensions of the conflict. Still, because the parties were not making progress on their own and the September deadline they set for themselves was fast approaching, I thought we had no choice. We can't afford to leave a single stone unturned in the search for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. Now, at Camp David, both sides engaged in comprehensive discussions that were really unprecedented because they dealt with the most sensitive issues dividing them. Profound and complex questions that long had been considered off limits. Under the operating rules that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, they are, of course, not bound by any proposal discussed at the summit. However, while we did not get an agreement here, significant progress was made on the core issues. I want to express my appreciation to Prime Minister Barak, Chairman Arafat, and their delegations for the efforts they undertook to reach an agreement. Prime Minister Barak showed particular courage, vision, and an understanding of the historical importance of this moment. Chairman Arafat made it clear that he too remains committed to the path of peace. The trilateral statement we issued affirms both leaders' commitment to avoid violence or unilateral actions which will make peace more difficult, and to keep the peace process going until it reaches a successful conclusion. At the end of this summit, I am fully aware of the deep disappointment that will be felt on both sides. But it was essential for Israelis and Palestinians finally to begin to deal with the toughest decisions in the peace process.
So both sides were still trying to pursue peace amid all of this violence.
Yes, and as you can imagine, that was quite a challenge. Despite all of the violence that we've been talking about that was going on through the 1990s after Oslo, that was actually supposed to be a time of peace, right? There was not actually an uprising or a war going on. But in September of 2000, the hopes, or any hopes for peace and the success of Oslo deteriorated when Ariel Sharon, who was then an Israeli politician who would go on to become the Israeli prime minister, he visited the Temple Mount, which is where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located. And that is considered to be one of Islam's holiest sites. And so although his visit didn't involve violence itself, it really made a lot of people angry, which led to protests and acts of civil disobedience, and then riots, and then erupted into a full-on uprising, which was then labeled the Second Intifada.
So, Laura, did the Second Intifada lead to more violence?
Yes. I mean, I know it's hard to imagine given all of the deaths and the suicide bombings that we've been talking about, but the violent acts by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, what we call PIJ, became unhinged. And even some elements of the Palestinian Authority joined in the acts of violence. So you had firearms attacks, you had suicide bombings, other types of even vehicle attacks, like we hear about, or we've heard about recently with the ISIS-inspired guys taking vehicles and ramming people. They started doing that even back then.
So I'm certain we will talk about some of those attacks.
Yes, we will. But first, before we do that, let's talk about what was happening at the time in the United States in 2000. The family of David Boim, remember that teenager, the American teenager that was murdered at his bus stop? His family filed a federal lawsuit in Illinois against a number of parties, including the HLF, the IAP, and the UASR, under the Anti-Terrorism Act, alleging that those organizations were liable for the death of David because they had provided support to Hamas during that time period.
David Boim, the son of Stanley and Joyce Boim, was a yeshiva student in Beit El outside Jerusalem in 1996. That murder by Hamas of David Boim resulted in a lawsuit brought by his parents, Stanley and Joyce Boim, in federal court here in Chicago under the Anti-Terrorism Act. The defendants were organizations here in the United States that were providing material support to Hamas. And that included the Holy Land Foundation. It also included an organization called the Islamic Association for Palestine. And under the Anti-Terrorism Act, even though this murder took place in Israel, far from the United States, the Boims were able to sue these organizations here in Chicago.
Wow, that is quite a development.
Yes, it was. I do not believe that the HLF and IAP and UASR were really anticipating something like that. And, interestingly, Shukri Abu Baker, who was the executive director of the HLF, and Mohamed El-Mezain, the chairman of the board of the HLF, once that lawsuit was filed, they recognized that they would have support from a number of their friends. They had a large group by this point in the United States. But Shukri Abu Baker worried about what was going to happen when that civil case evolved into the discovery phase.
So, Laura, when you say discovery phase, you're referring to documents and evidence that each party to a lawsuit has to produce to the other party for review. And then the court orders the discovery, so the parties are supposed to comply.
Yes, that's exactly right. So there, when you have criminal trials, the government and the defense have to produce discovery, but it's the same thing in a civil trial, right? So the defendants were going to be forced to produce documents and evidence in the discovery phase of the trial. And this call in May between Shukri Abu Baker and Mohamed El-Mezain, that shows where they kind of discuss that the Boim family lawsuit. And Shukri told El-Mezain, the only thing they want is what they call discovery. They want to gain access to our books. So and this is Shukri talking to Mohamed El-Mezain, I sent you yesterday the minutes of the last meeting we held, Abu Ibrahim. Abu Ibrahim is the nickname of Mohamed El-Mezain. Ibrahim is his oldest son, so father of Ibrahim. So Shukri says, Abu Ibrahim, you have a lot of papers in Arabic, right? Meeting minutes and stuff like that, he's asking him. Shukri then went on to speak in code and suggest that Mohamed El-Mezain give those papers to a street vendor. In other words, get rid of that stuff before we get caught with it, right? And Shukri goes on to say, when he's talking about what to get rid of, to give to the street vendor, anything in Arabic. This is going to be important later. Then Mezain insists that their papers are clean. But Shukri is a little bit worried still. He persists and says, anything, meeting minutes and stuff like that, all of it, because we approve the English only, Abu Ibrahim. Do you hear what I'm saying? So he's clearly, passing that message. Are you getting what are you picking up what I'm putting down? Do you understand? Get rid of it. And this is going to be important later. And, you think back to the Philadelphia meeting, right? Different message to the American public than the Arabic and Palestinian community. So it's the same thing. It's like the Arabic version. No.
That's amazing because it's a crime to destroy items that are subject to rules of discovery.
Yes, for sure. I mean, it's a violation of the law. So, going back to just in general what these organizations were doing during this time period, the HLF continued to support a number of the Hamas social infrastructure organizations in Gaza and the West Bank. And they funded a school that was administered through the Islamic Charitable Society of Hebron. We talked about that in the Philadelphia meeting. We've talked about that before. The Islamic Charitable Society of Hebron was part of Hamas's social infrastructure, and they ran a school. And I want us to take a look at a video from that school.
وما زالت تنبت من الأبطال الأشداء الذين كانوا ولا يزالوا يسومون هذا العدو سوء العذاب بعملياتهم الفدائية وأرواح استشهاديهم الأبطال قائمة طويلة لا مجال لحصرها، ولكن نذكر منهم المهندس الشهيد البطل يحيى عياش أبو البراء. الشهيد البطل يحيى عبد اللطيف عياش، مهندس مدرسة جهاد ومقاومة، مهندس كهربائي طور أسلوب الهجمات الاستشهادية ردا على مذبحة المسجد الإبراهيمي في الخليل. ومن أقواله: قد أكون المهندس الأول ولكنني لست الأخير ومن بعدي ألوف. تحية للكتائب عز الدين، تحية للكتائب عز الدين. الشهيد البطل عمار عمارنة قائد عملية الاختيار بتاريخ 31/4/1994 أسفرت العملية البطولية عن مقتل 5 صهاينة، إصابة ما يزيد عن 32 آخرين حسب الإحصاءات الرسمية للعدو، وقد كان من بين القتلى عدد من جنود الاحتلال الصهاينة. تحية للكتائب عز الدين، تحية للكتائب عز الدين. الشهيد البطل صالح عبد الرحيم صوي قائد عملية ديزنغوف في قلب مدينة تل أبيب الإسرائيلية بتاريخ 10/10/1994 أدى إلى مقتل 23 صهيونيا، إصابة ما يزيد عن 47 آخرين. تحية للكتائب عز الدين، تحية للكتائب عز الدين.
The HLF also continued to support hospitals, as they discussed in the 1993 conspiratorial meeting. They really wanted to focus on supporting hospitals, and they supported teachers and they supported students. And you can see all of this documentation here that shows that they were, furthering that agenda that they set so many years ago.
And all this is quite consistent with what they planned to do back in 1993.
Yes, it is. Meanwhile, Hamas continued its ruthless targeting of civilians in Israel. On June 1 of 2001, a Hamas suicide bomber attacked a popular nightclub in Tel Aviv called the Dolphinarium, killing 21 people and injuring 120.
And this is a nightclub where people are going to dance and have fun and relax. It's just unbelievable.
Yes. And, nightclubs, and then very shortly thereafter, in August of 2001, they attacked a Sparrow pizzeria where they killed 15. The Sparrow pizza bombing was a very interesting event because a female named Alama Mahd al-Tamimi transported the bomb and the suicide bomber, the Hamas suicide bomber, to the Sparrow pizzeria, where the bomber detonated explosives and killed 15 people, including 7 children, along with 2 Americans, one of whom was a pregnant 31-year-old school teacher and the other a 15-year-old. Alama al-Tamimi drove the bomber to the location after pledging to carry out attacks on behalf of Hamas's military wing. And the way that they were able to reduce suspicion on the way there was that she and the suicide bomber dressed as Israelis, and she concealed the bomb inside a guitar case, and then ultimately ended up facilitating this attack. She is wanted by the FBI for her role in this attack. So while all of that evil was happening and hate and violence, the HLF continued to operate, and under their cloak of charity, and they continued to try to avoid government scrutiny. But interestingly, despite all of their planning and deceit and lies, they did not anticipate what the U.S. government was actually investigating.
Oh, tell us about that.
Yeah, this is very interesting. It was around the time that the HLF was founded. So let's go back to history, because I have to tell you a little bit of the history. So going back to the beginning, at that time, its senior officers were Shukri Abu Baker, Mohamed El-Mezain, and Ghassan Alashi. We've talked about all of these gentlemen. During that same time period, the Alashi family, whose cousin Nadia was Musa Abu Marzouk's wife, the Alashi family established a business, a computer company. It was originally called ICC Tech, but about the time the HLF changed its name, ICC Tech changed its name to Infocom. So they established this computer company called Infocom, and it existed directly across the street from the Holy Land Foundation. Now, Ghassan Alashi was one of the main leaders. He and his brothers were leaders of Infocom, and Ghassan Alashi was concurrently a leader in the HLF. They were right across the street from each other. Well, it turns out that the FBI was quietly investigating Infocom and its officers, the Alashi brothers, Ghassan Alashi, Bayan Alashi, Basman Alashi, and a couple of the other brothers, for commerce violations. They were accused of illegally shipping prohibited items to countries that were at the time labeled as state sponsors of terrorism, and that's illegal, and then lying about what it was that they were shipping on their export forms that they had to file by law. They were also being investigated for unlawfully dealing in the property of Musa Abu Marzouk, who we spoke about. He himself was personally designated as a specially designated terrorist in 1995. So any continued dealing in his property after that date of the designation is illegal conduct, right? So that's what the government was investigating Infocom for, but Infocom wasn't in the media. There was no indication that anybody was aware of what they were doing.
That is very interesting. So Marzouk had invested money in Infocom in the early 1990s while he was overseeing the US-based Hamas front organizations.
Yes.
Wow.
Yep. He was busy.
Yeah, a little bit.
And so, that investigation into Infocom led to a joint terrorism task force search warrant that was executed by about 80 agents. Search warrant of Infocom that lasted several days. And, these guys, the HLF and IAP and UASR guys, they were prepared for an FBI raid against the HLF, given all of the heat in the media, knowing how intensely they had been scrutinized. What they were not expecting was a raid next door.
And let me guess, did CARE defend them?
Of course. They certainly did. If you look at media articles back then, you see statements by CARE officials defending Infocom. And, let us remember Ghassan Alashi of the HLF and Infocom, who also held roles in the IAP. He was one of the attendees at the Philadelphia meeting in 1993, along with CARE founder Nahad Awad, where they planned to, frankly, create CARE and lie to the Americans. And so if you look at like a Los Angeles Times article from September 7th of 2001, so, right after the search warrant of Infocom started, Nahad Awad, as the executive director of CARE, told the media that the raid was merely because the U.S. opposed criticism of Israel, not because of any like lawful or legal search warrants or anything else like that. And then the New York Times quoted IAP leader Rafiq Jabber. He was the president of the IAP at the time, and he said that Infocom was being raided because it's a Muslim company. Again, continuing with the mantra that they would put these false narratives out there and disregard the actual facts. This article also quoted some groups as saying the raid was a, quote, anti-Muslim witch hunt, and also that Israel was conducting apartheid. And so again, we're talking about using false narratives with words that appeal to Americans to gain sympathy from the Americans, right? All of this is just being done because Israel is committing apartheid, not because Infocom and its officers were committing crimes.
Yes, that sounds very familiar.
Yes, and Infocom was not just a computer company. They were also an internet service provider at the time. They provided web hosting to a number of entities in the United States and abroad, including the HLF and the IAP, and even Al Jazeera and Birzeit University. That's the university where Yahya Ayyash, the engineer, the bomb maker, attended. So they were quite a big business at the time.
So, Laura, did the terrorism task force agents, did they find any evidence?
Yes, they did. They found a lot of evidence, and they found a couple hundred boxes of HLF documents that were apparently being hidden over there across the street. And not surprisingly, those were primarily written in Arabic, not English. Remember, Shukri Abu Baker was worried about the Arabic documents, and looks like they were hidden there purposely according to their own security protocols. Speaking of security protocols, one item found there at Infocom among HLF's other documents was the HLF's security manual. And let's look at it, and then we can revisit some of the other sensitive documents that were seized and some of them we've already spoken about. We just weren't able to connect exactly where they came from. Well, they came from these hidden boxes that were across the street at Infocom at this place where they believed it was safe. So this document is entitled The Foundation's Policies and Guidelines. The foundation is short for Holy Land Foundation. And let's look at some of the, this is the picture of the document. It was written in Arabic, and then, of course, that's the translation that corresponds to it. And on the first page of this document, it talks about the guidelines for in-person meetings, like stating they needed to agree on a cover for the reason of the meeting. That's an actual quote there in the document. They weren't supposed to repeat more than 2 meetings at the same location. They were supposed to avoid having meetings at the homes of those who were under watch. So, they realized that they were likely being watched, and they needed to be very careful where they were meeting, who they were meeting with. The document even goes into, arriving and departing from the meeting in steady time intervals, and arranging papers at the meetings in a manner that made them easy to get rid of in an emergency.
Wow, Laura, this is certainly an extensive amount of security protocol for an alleged charity.
Yes, and it goes on. There is a section in that document, and we'll show it here, that talked about classifying documents in categories such as general, limited, private, and very private. And there was a coded numbering system that corresponded with the classification of the document. So you can see that, number 2 here is the coding system for private documents. And interestingly, the number 2 is at the top of the front page of this security manual.
Okay. And I've read this document. It's very long, very detailed, and it talks about traveling undercover, hiding documents. They say hiding them good.
Right.
It also defines when it is permissible to speak on the phone or even fax somebody.
Yes, it was quite detailed document going over a number of different things that they were and were not allowed to do and how they were allowed to do them. And they specifically noted that exposed people, meaning those that were suspected of being part of Hamas, they were to keep apart and separated from the ones that had not yet been exposed as part of this Hamas infrastructure. Very interesting.
So, Laura, what types of other documents were found secreted at Infocom?
Well, there are a lot of very interesting documents, and most of them, again, were written in Arabic. And we can take a look at a couple of them, but just, again, remembering how Shukri Abu Baker told Mohamed El-Mezain, you need to get those Arabic documents out of your office. Well, that's, a lot of these were in Arabic. And here's one. It was a thank you letter from Abdel Aziz Rantisi's wife for the HLF who had sent them money. Rantisi was one of the senior leaders of Hamas that was departed to Marshall's Horror, Lebanon in December of 1992 that we've talked about a number of times.
Okay. Didn't he go on to become the senior leader of Hamas in 2004 with the death of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin?
Yes, and it's very, very interesting, and we will go on to talk about that in a future episode when we get to that time frame. But clearly the HLF was sending the money. Other interesting items found hidden at Infocom were reports by Shukri Abu Baker on his visit to various Sakat committees in the West Bank, and even his visit with Hamas leader and founder Mahmoud Zahar that we've talked about in prior episodes, who is still a senior leader in Hamas's political bureau today. And Shukri Abu Baker reported on his meeting with him. His nickname was, as you remember, Abu Khalid. Other documents that were found in those hidden boxes were letters from Shukri Abu Baker, like this one, acknowledging receipt of additional money from Musa Abu Marzouk through an intermediary.
Oh, but Shukri Abu Baker told the media that Marzouk made a one-time donation after a conference. This clearly demonstrates that it's a lie.
And another document that was hidden at Infocom, we can take a look at it, and we've seen it before, was the written summary of what was agreed upon at the 1993 Philadelphia conspiratorial meeting. And in this document, again, we showed it some episodes back, but this is where they planned all of their agenda that they were going to set in place and then did. The document, of course, includes the resolution to create a political and public relations bureau in Washington, D.C. to protect their interests. And that's the organization that we identified as what ultimately became CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. So this document was, that's where it was found. It was found hidden at Infocom.
Well, I can see why they would want to hide that one.
Right? Because CARE is not supposed to have anything to do with Hamas or, those groups. And then other documents, there were so many that were found over at Infocom, included requests by people for books on Hamas, and Shukri Abu Baker's response to them in an official letter on HLF letterhead saying, "We received your request and passed it to the IAP because they're the ones responsible for distributing the Hamas literature."
So, Laura, how long did you say that search at Infocom lasted?
Several days. It was quite long because of at the time, it was a web hosting business. There was a lot of computer data. And that search ended on or about September 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you next time. Hey, 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 hey,